This is an example number 6.1 from chapter 6, working with ranges in the Albright VBA text. This is going to be on page 99 in the book. We're going to run through this first sub, range 1, and look at what it does. Let's look at some code. This sub refers to ranges literally. It could be used to know the size. If you know the size of a data range is not going to change. This is pretty significant. Many times you're writing code, and the difference or question here is, will the size of the data change? Are they going to be adding new data? Is there going to be data that's going to be deleted or removed? Is there going to be data that's changed? Are there duplicates in the data? In the situation where there's no duplicates, there's no change in what the data range is going to be, you can refer to a specific range directly, or in this case, literally. So in this particular sub, we have our with construction. We're using the WS data, referring to the code name for this sheet inside this file. I'll go ahead and close my other one here. Here's the one we're working on. I'm working on ranges.xlsm, module 1, sub range 1. So with construction, inside of WS data, we have message boxes. We're going to run 4 message boxes. They're simply going to give us the address for these 4 ranges. And then they're going to, following that, there's 2 more lines where we're going to use a message box that talks about the first employee's first score. Notice here, the book does make the distinction here that these 2 lines do the exact same thing in VBA. It turns out that the default property for a range is the .value property. The book also goes on to say that we always should go ahead and use .value. It's a good habit to get into. It makes the code more readable. I agree with that. It does work this way. So I'm going to click inside the sub. I'm going to click on my handy dandy green arrow. I know that this sheet is active. So I'm in the sub. I'm going to click on that. And here's our first message box, A1, which is what we expected. Simply the address of the range. Click OK. And the next range, B1 to F1. Click OK. Next range, A2 to A19. OK. And then finally, B2, F19. Click OK. And there's this first message box down here. The first employee's first score is 90. So here's employee 1. Score 1 is 90. How are they getting that? They're simply referring to the range B2 literally in the code. Range B2 is the score for employee 1. And that's popping up in this message box. Also notice the concatenation here. We're using the ampersand to concatenate the string with the actual value of that cell. Space, ampersand, space. Click OK. We get the same message box again, which is this second version down here. We click OK, and that range 1 is done. Next is range 2. This is also at the end of page 99, as well as to page 100. We're creating and deleting range names. So let's walk through sub range 2. This is going to use another with construction, referencing the WS data worksheet code name. And here we're adding names to the worksheet. It's interesting to note that there's 2 ways to add named ranges in Excel. And one is on the worksheet level, where it's just for that specific worksheet. The other is at the workbook level, where it's named for the entire workbook. You get a sense for that if you go to Excel and go into the name manager, and you can filter by name scoped to worksheet or names scoped to workbook. There's another evidence of the difference that you can create a name manager for. We could scope it to a workbook or to a specific worksheet. So this one in the code is referring to a worksheet reference because we're using this with WS data and we're putting a name into that worksheet. So these are the 3 named ranges. These are the names, and then these are the ranges that these names refer to. B1 to F1 for this score names, A2 to A19 for employee numbers. If we look at this, B1 to F1 are the score names. A2 to A19 is the employee numbers. And then the score data is the actual data, B2 through F19, right here. So we have these 3 named ranges, and we're going to have a message box after they're created that says these sheet names have been created, which are actually named ranges. Then the code allows us to delete these named ranges. So we can go into these names that have been created and just delete them. We're going to use the delete method for deleting each one of these names. Then a message box appears and says, okay, names have been deleted. In addition, the example here also adds a loop that deletes all the names. So instead of having to type in each name, let's say there was 50 different names or something, we could actually just use this code to delete all the names if we wanted to do that. That may be faster, maybe preferred. Notice here that this is a type of data that we have not seen yet in class. This is as name, right? We're declaring a variable here on this line. The variable is nm, and it's declaring nm as name. This is a different type that we've not seen yet been declared. This is an object type, a specific object, referring to named ranges. And then they use that variable nm in the loop to delete all the named ranges inside of this collection of objects, names. So that's a note. That's interesting to note that there is another data type here. Let's go ahead and run this. So I'm going to click on the Excel, click inside this sub. I'll click on the green button. Sheet names have been created. Now I could come down. It's not going to let me do that. I could come. If I click OK, it'll keep running. I was looking for a place to confirm those been created before they're deleted, but I went ahead and closed that window and they've already been deleted. And I click again and they've been deleted twice, although they were already deleted once, so the second deletion had no effect in essence. But if we were to do the F8 method, we could see and confirm this. So if I click on inside the sub, click on F8, that says it's about to run the sub, F8 again, F8 again, again, F8. Now we can come back into this Excel and we can go into the name manager, and sure enough, there they are. So we created these using this code. And maybe we'll just leave this open for a second and we'll continue to run the code. It's not going to let me. I actually have to close this window and then come back to the code and click F8. And that shows the message box, and F8, 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 F8. And the names have been deleted. So now we can come back here to the Excel, go to the name manager. Sure enough, they're gone. And now we can do this as well, but we don't really need to because they're already deleted. This just is a second way to delete names. So I'll go ahead and reset this, and we're good for sub range 2. So let's look at example 3 here, 6.3. This deals with formatting ranges. We're going to format a range based on a named range. So if a range has a named range, you can refer to it. We're going to do with WS data. Again, this is the code name of the sheet, WS data. We're going to add a name. Score data refers to B2 to F19. This refers to this data here. We're going to create a named range, and we're just going to bold that name range after we've named it. We're going to refer to it on the very next line. So here we're creating the name. The next line we are referring to that and then bolding that entire range. And that's that. Then we'll see a message box that says the range has been bolded, bold-faced. And then we're going to turn it off. We'll create another with statement. We'll reference that named range, score data, and we'll turn it off by saying font.bold equals false. And then we're going to delete the named range, names score data dot delete. And the message box will then say the score data range is no longer bold-faced and no longer exists for that matter. So I'm going to click inside the sub. I'll click on the run button. Score data range has been bold-faced. Look at that. It's all bold-faced. I click OK. The score data range is no longer bold-faced. It's no longer boldface. And if we come up here, there's no named ranges, so it's also been deleted. That is example range 3. Let's look at range 4. Subroutine range 4. Same as the previous sub. And we're going to store the range name in a variable. And this variable is RNG name. We declared this variable as a string. We're going to put a string into that variable that has quotes. The quotes are included in that string. And then we're going to reference that. How are we going to reference that? Well, let's see. Here's our with WS data. Again, the code name for this worksheet. We're going to add a name. And the name we're going to add is RNG name, the variable name. Notice we don't need quotes because there's quotes inside of this variable. The value inside that variable contains those quote marks, so we don't need quote marks here. And then we're going to make a reference to which range we want to create. And then we're going to bold that range. And we're going to have a message box that says it's bold. And then we're going to turn off the bold. And then we're going to delete the named range. So very similar to range 3. The difference here is we're going to create a variable that stores the name that we're going to use for our named range here. Let's see how this works. I'll use the F8 method this time. So F8, F8, and F8. We've created the variable. We've stored the name in the variable. I could come down to the immediate window and question mark range name is score data. So at this point, range name has been, there's a value inside that variable. And I'll hit F8 again. We'll create the named range using the variable. And then we should see these numbers get bolded after I hit F8 again. Sure enough, they're all bolded. These numbers are bolded. We'll end the with. We'll display the message box. Range has been bolded. We'll continue F8, F8, F8. Now they're no longer bolded. And there's no longer a named range, RNG name here. Notice if I click on the immediate window and type in RNG name, what do we expect to see? We still expect to see this name, score data, because this variable has not changed, right? We haven't deleted the variable here. We've only deleted the named range, which is here. So when I hit enter, RNG name enter, we're going to see still score data as part of that variable name. And enter, there it is, just like we expected. What's only been deleted is the named range, not the variable value. We'll go back to the sub, we'll hit F8, F8, and there's the message box, and F8 will end the sub. And that is range 4. Okay, let's do another one. Example 6.5, using the cells property in the top left, bottom right combination. In this example, we're referring to a range with the cells property. Again, we're using the with WS data. We're referring to the WS data code name of the ranges file, that sheet. That's the code name of the sheet. We're adding a range name, score data, and it's referring to range B2 through F9. B2 to F19. And we want to display the address of the second row, third column of the score range data. Which cell is that? So if we go from of score data, the second row, 1, 2, that's going to be row 3. And we're going to go to the third column of that range, which is BCD. So the cell is actually D3. D3 is the cell that's being referred to inside of the range score data using cells 2, 3. It's the second row. Row 2 is the first row inside of this range. right? Here's the first row, here's the second row, here's the first, second, third column. So D3 is what's referenced here in cells 2, 3. We're going to select it, and we're going to show the address in a message box. The next one is we're going to create a range from a range. So here's a double range. We have a range, and then we have a parentheses, kind of a long parentheses here. And this is the method where we select the top left cell and the bottom right cell. So this is the top left cell, and there's a comma, and this is the bottom right cell in the range that we want to select. So let's figure that out. Which one is the top left? So score data we know is B2 through F19. Within this B2 through F19, we're looking for row 2, column 2. So row 2, column 2 would be C3. So the top left of this new range is right here. The bottom right is cells 3 and 4. And we're going to go back to the Excel, and let's just count this out. So this is the third row, 1, 2, 3. The fourth column, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that would be E4. So the top left is C3. The bottom right is E4. That's what we would expect this line in the code to select, including this. So we're using the with range, and then display a message box that says the address of the selected range is, and then it gives us the address. And then another method here is to define a new variable. And the name of the variable is score range. We're going to define that variable as an object variable, specifically a range object. And the way we define that is just like we define all other variables. We DIM it, and we name it, and then we say as, and the variable type. In this case, it's going to be range. And the new thing here, too, is we're going to use the word set. And this is used specifically for, well, used for other things, too, but you have to use it when you're setting a range variable to an actual range. Turns out you need to use set. Just one of those things in VBA. It won't work if you don't use set. Again, that's for setting a range variable, which is this range variable, to a specific range. Once we have set that variable to this range, we can use it and reference it as we identify a very similar method. We're going to use that range variable using an upper left, top left, and a bottom right cell, and then display another message box with the address. Finally, the code's going to delete the named range, not the data, right? Just the actual named range. And then it's going to select A1. Kind of put the cursor back at the top left, I guess, just to be nice. And so with that, let's go ahead and run this. Let me select the A1 cell over here just to reposition our selection. Come into the sub with my cursor. I'll click F8, and we're ready to go. F8 again, F8, F8. So we've just created this named range. And there's the score data that was just created here. Back to the module, I'll click F8, F8, and it's selected. Score data cells 2, 3. Why is that? Because this range, B2 through F19, is the score data range. And within that, we're using the cells notation, which is 2 is the row, 3 is the column, 2 down 2 rows, over 3 columns, and that's D3. We'll hit F8 one more time, back to the mod, hit F8. That'll give us the message box. The address of the selected cell is D3. We'll hit F8 again. We'll go down to the second approach here. With this range, select, and then a message box. So we'll hit F8. We'll select it. Again, that's using C3 as the top left and E4 as the bottom right, using this cell notation. We'll hit F8 again with the message box of C3 and E4 as a selected range and end width. Finally, we'll set the score range to score data. So we've created a range variable, and we're going to do a very similar thing. We're going to select the top left cell, comma, bottom right cell as part of an entire range, right? This is within the parentheses of a range. And then we'll select that. I'll click F8. I'll click F8 again. It is the same range. And then we'll get the message box that says the address of the selected range is C3 through E4. Click OK. Click F8. And now we are ready to delete the score data named range. After I hit F8, we can check that up here. It has now been deleted. There's no score data named range. Click back in the sub. Click F8 again. We've moved the selection back to A1, and we can F8, 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 and we are done with the sub. Okay, let's keep going. The next example, example 6.6 in the book, moves on to situations where the range will change. And we assume that the number of rows and or columns could change. So how do we find the range in this particular example? Well, we start out with declaring a range variable. This name of the variable is A1. So it's going to set A1 to the range A1, just that one cell. Then it's going to add a name. And it's going to name scores range, but what is it going to refer to? It's going to refer to the range A1 offset 0, 1. This is going to be the top left cell, right? And this is going to be the bottom right cell. So a very similar method that we saw in the previous example. And what is offset? So offset in the book is talked about offsetting, in this case, from A1. 0 is referring to the row. 1 is the column. So we're going to offset one column, but it's going to be on the same row. That'll be our top left. And then we're going to do end XL to right. What is this going to do? This is going to take us to the end of this row, all the way to F1. So that means that this score names named reference is referencing B1 through F1. It's next going to create a new named range. And the reason here that we're doing this is because we could add additional scores. We could come to G and insert a column here for score 6 or for score 7, etc. And if we did that, we could come back and run this code here, and the score names named range would be accurate because it would go all the way to include the score in G, in the column G, score 6, for example. Right, so here's score 6, and we could put some scores in here if we wanted to. Wait, these are bad scores. Let me do better scores. And then this code would run after we put these scores in, and this would include score 6 in this score named range. In previous examples, it would not include score 6 if we ran previous code. It would simply refer to direct reference to F1. But using this end command, Excel to right, it's as if we were over here in Excel and we just hit Shift Control Right arrow. And we've selected all of the cells that have data, and then it stops right there. So that's basically what we've done in the code to this point. That's what that end Excel to right means. Next, we'll create a new named range for employee numbers, and you can probably guess what this is going to be referring to. But we'll start with range A1 again. Again, this before the comma is kind of like the top left set for that range. And then after this comma will be the bottom right cell for that range. In this case, we're starting with 1. So we're actually going down one row. So that's going to be here, A2. We're offsetting from what cell? From A1, which is range up here, A1. We're offsetting one row, but 0 columns. So it's going to be the same column. Then comma, end XL down. So it's almost like we're here. We'll do Shift, hold down Control, and do one touch of down arrow. And sure enough, we select all those cells at once. That's what this command does in VBA. So we're selecting all those cells, and sure enough, those are the cells we need for employee numbers. Now, the way this works is we have to have an empty cell after that, right? So notice this is a blank cell here. That's where Excel knows where to stop. And that's a pretty good assumption. Most of the time, that's a good assumption, a valid assumption of where the data stops. The next named range is score data. And again, we're going to refer to, again, A1. The offset here is going to be one row and one column. So that's going to put us at B2. Comma, we're going to go end down and end to the right. So if I click here, I'm going to do Shift, Control, down arrow. That'll get us down. And I'm still holding Shift and Control down with one hand. Now I'm going to type the right arrow once, and that gets the entire data in that table. So what this command does here in this code is select, just like I did with my Shift, Control, and arrows, all of that data, and that's going to be score data as the named range. So this is another way to reference and to create named ranges without knowing exactly how many rows or how many columns there's going to be, or to allow for the number of columns and rows to change. Then the code goes on to provide a second alternative approach to doing the very same functional objective. We can first find the number of columns and the number of rows and then use these as numbers. So here we've created two variables. The first variable is n scores. We've defined that as an integer. And then we have n employees, also defined as an integer. We're still using A1. A1 was set up here as a range object, which is still single cell, A1. Now we're going to put values into the n scores variable, which is going to be a count. Notice at the very end it says count. We're simply counting the columns in this range. And again, we're going to use an offset, and we're going to use the .end XL to write. And what this is going to do, just like it did up here in the score names, we're going to offset one column, 0 rows. So this is A. This is still this is still row 1. We're going to go to column B, and then we're going to select all of the columns to the right in that row, and then we're just going to return a count. So if we run this, n scores is going to be a number of a simple number. In this case, it's going to be the number of columns. Then we're going to have a message box that's going to tell us how many columns or the number of scores. It's going to set another variable in employees, which we declared above, again to a range, and we're going to count the rows. So very similar to the columns, we're going to count the rows. We're going to start at range A1 dot offset 1 row, 0 columns. So that will be A2. And then we'll do end Excel down, and we'll select all of these cells to there, and we'll count. It's simply returning us a count. The number of rows, give us a count. And it's going to stick that number inside of this variable in employees. And then it's going to give us another message box. Now it says we're going to include row 1, column A in the range, just for variety here. In this particular situation, we have A1. We're still in the with construction here. For the WS data, we're adding a new named range, and this is going to be called the entire data set here. What's the offset? The offset is 0, 0, which means it's going to include or start with A1. That's going to be the top left cell inside this range. What's the bottom right cell, which is this code? We're going to offset the number of employees, which is what? That's the number of rows, comma, the number of scores, which is the number of columns. And we're simply going to use those numbers that we obtained from these variables as the offset to obtain and create this new named range. And then we do a message box that describes the addresses for that range. And then at the very end here, we'll delete everything and all the named ranges will be gone. So let's run this. This is range 6. I'll click inside the sub. Let me go ahead and go to A1 here in the spreadsheet. Click back in the sub. Click F8. We'll run the sub. Sub range 6. Set A1 to A1. And that is done. So we've created the A1 range object. With AWS data, create this first named range. So score names, we're going to offset to B1. We're going to go all the way to G1 in this case. I'll click F8 again, and it will be created. We can come up here and click on this. There's our score names. And it includes score 6 because we use the end XL down. I'll come back to the sub. I'll click F8. We've created the employee numbers. I'll click F8 again. We've created the score data. End width. This is the other way to do it, where we use the numbers. I can click F8 here, F8 here, F8 here. There are 6 scores for each employee, which is true. There's 6 scores here. I can come down here to the immediate window, do question mark, end scores, and that gives us the value of 6. We can see that. I can go back to the sub. I'll click inside the sub, run F8 again. We have number of employees, so I can check that if I wanted to. N employees, enter, and it's blank. Why would that be blank? Because I spelled it wrong. Look at that, 3 E's. How about that? So if I spell it correctly, hit enter, there's our 8. There you go. And then we're ready to go back into the sub. We'll click F8. We'll get the message box. There are 8 employees. We'll continue. We'll create a new named range entire data set. F8. Now we should see all 4 now. Employee numbers, entire data set, score data, and score names have been created in the worksheet. Back in the sub, we'll click F8. There's the message box. Entire data set is in the range A1 through G9. So that is the entire data set. That's the last named range that we created. I'll click OK. End with, and then we can delete all these names. We've created a name object, NM, and it's going to delete, next, 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 and I lost track. That must have been 4, and then we're done because there's no more to delete, and we'll click F8 again, and we're done with that sub. So these first 6 examples in chapter 6 are helpful to identify and understand how do we reference ranges in the code. Quite a few ways to reference these ranges. I invite you to continue to look at these examples, to walk through them, and to see and understand how they work.